presenting a paper on what does it take to be popular in the eyes of the news media. And I used the data from 2009 European elections. But the paper is really about women candidates, because previous research suggests that the women candidates do not exactly get the same share of coverage as they have among candidates. So there's kind of a story about a group bias in the media, that it's not only like that that we have some kind of individual level problem here, but the problem is that it seems to be a systematic group bias where one gender is covered better in the media than the other side. And the real problem is that if it had no electoral consequences, we shouldn't worry about it. But we should think that there might be some consequences to this bias, after that bias. And that's why we're worried about it. But surprisingly enough, there's relatively little knowledge about what influences the amount of coverage female candidates receive. And especially not cross-national. But I don't talk much about the theory because I would want to concentrate on that model. So the main expectations is that one thing that for sure should matter how much coverage a candidate gets is how viable the candidate is. We would expect that a competitive candidate is also more popular in the eyes of the media, that there's already the parties to kind of a selection procedure to the media, that the media is not really interested in the whole range of candidates. In the case of EP elections, I don't expect incumbents really to have a positive impact on the media coverage, because the media is national and the EP is EU. So the problem is that the incumbents are actually further away from their national media environment. They're in Brussels, and therefore they should not have an advantage because of that. Then the other thing is that I expected in preferential voting, because there's no variation in electoral systems in the EP elections really, because most countries use preferential voting or proportional electoral system or semi-proportional electoral system. But there's a variation in the type of voting system the country uses, whether it's preferential voting or closed and blocked party list. And since I think that female candidates have worse chances in preferential voting systems, because there I would expect the coverage to focus more on candidates and less on parties. And as men in general have an advantage over being more dominant in the politics, then the media might reinforce this effect. Then I don't whether there are quotas or not, party quotas or legislative quotas. I don't expect them to really help female candidates' media coverage. I'm not talking about the electoral success of these candidates. But in terms of media coverage, first of all, party quotas, except for Sweden, don't say how viable the candidate needs to be. And therefore, they might be perceived by media just as seat fillers that actually have no substantive reason to be there, and therefore they might actually be even disadvantaged, because it's a very kind of, let's say, I'm not against quotas in general, but in the case of media coverage, I don't think they help the candidate, because they're very kind of artificial measure, while the media is more maybe dependent on how the society is, which I think in the end that it might actually be that everything else is kind of a spurious effect, and it's overall gender equality in the society that does the difference. Makes sense. I used the 2009 European election media content study. Here's just a summary of the data. I used only it codes all stories that are about EP elections, and then in TVs all other political news, and in newspapers the first page and another page of news. And it codes in each story main actors. And I picked the stories where a candidate was a political actor. So that this left me with over 7,000 occasions where a candidate was mentioned. And this is used for the aggregate level analysis. I also use the candidate level model, but there I have much less cases. But this 7,000 is not the amount of candidates, it's just like the number of times they were mentioned in total. So some were mentioned really a lot, some little. But I have over 550 candidates then in the candidate level model that had their personal actor code in the media study. So that's why I could link the data from the European Parliament on their incumbency and on their list position and so on to see if it had any impact on their electability. But there's one other problem, is that among these candidate level I have only very viable candidates, because only candidates in the top of the election list have their personal actor code. And another thing is that media anyway tends to cover the viable candidates. So we have to keep in mind that the candidate level model is about competitive candidates primarily. And the other thing is that, but still among these competitive candidates, 87% of them got zero media coverage in these outlets that we covered, which leads us to a bit of a modeling problem. But that's why in the candidate level model I use a Tobit regression model. It's a censored model that in essence divides the database independent variable into two groups. You have the uncensored cases that it treats pretty much like OLS. And you have the censored cases where it then adds to the coefficients kind of the likelihood function of being censored, of having no coverage. So that in essence I treat the no media coverage as a pretty much a bit unobserved case where we have all the independent variable information about these people, but we kind of haven't managed to measure how much they were actually covered. So that's the logic. So the main variables, I have two dependent variables in the models. One is a standardized score of candidates' visibility. This is like the amount of times they were covered, and it's standardized compared to the whole country, what share of coverage they received. And then the other part is just the raw frequency, how many times they were mentioned. Then the main independent variables are then the candidate's viability, incumbency, voting system, preferential or closed and block party list, quotas, over gender equality, and in the model with the standardized score I also control for the MEP seats a country has, because if a country has a lot of seats, there are more candidates to be covered, so the share of the coverage each candidate gets is smaller. Okay. So first, some aggregate level results. Here we see on the x-axis is the proportion of women among candidates, and y-axis is how much coverage they got in the country. And we see that if it was on the diagonal line, it would be the perfect situation where they get as much coverage as is their share among candidates. This is not exactly the case for most countries. Sweden is an outlier, but Sweden has been an outlier also in previous studies dealing with Europe, and it's partly because they're just, in terms of gender equality, they're an outlier in Europe. Unfortunately, it's an outlier. Romania and Ireland, there were a question of one very dominant female candidate. One's case is in the daughter of a president, and in Ireland also, I don't exactly know who it was, but
Mary Lou McDonald.
Yeah, and so therefore they're a bit of an outliers. But here we see that there's not much relationship between the share of women among candidates and how much media coverage they get. Especially problematic are cases like Italy, Austria, Spain, where they're like 40% among candidates but receive around 5% of media coverage. Not very good. But in Italy it's just Berlusconi takes it all. I mean, it's just a list. Then, but then in order to control for the viability of a candidate, I used where the candidate is placed in the election list. And if we look at the candidates that are on the top one third of the list, we see that the situation starts to look more like what would be the nice situation. Where we see that there's not that big gap anymore between the share of women among candidates and the share of media coverage they receive. And if we look at the election list leaders only, then we see that the media actually doesn't discriminate that badly anymore when we only look at the real competitive candidates. So it's actually not so much what previous studies very often tend to say. They really like to blame the media for all bad things in the world, but actually this thing starts in the party offices where they place the candidates. And then on the candidate level, I hope you can see, it's very green. There the gender of a candidate is not very significant, only in one model, a very weak one. But that is, we have to keep in mind that this is the competitive candidates that we have in this model. So there actually there's not that much media discrimination going on. And incumbency, I say, expected negative effect, but what is really interesting is how consistent is the gender, the female and party quota, and female and legislative quota interaction terms, that they're really consistently negative impact on women candidates' coverage, which is something, yeah.
So when you set party quotas to 0, females get less coverage, is that it? When there's no party quotas, females get less coverage? Is that the
No, when there are party quotas, they get less coverage.
They get less coverage when there
Yeah.
are party
But
quotas.
we'll hold those questions till the end.
Yeah. But in essence, they show that the quotas have negative impact on female candidates. There was also actually the theoretical expectation, because that it doesn't have to mean that their electability really could increase, but since media covers the competitive candidates and quota doesn't set where the candidate needs to be always, then Sweden is an outlier in this case, because there it sometimes says where the candidate needs to be. But other than that, it doesn't really. It also might be that it's just there are more female candidates in spreads, so they have to spread the coverage between each other. If you know what I mean, because it's the share of coverage, and the two models on the right are the frequency of coverage they get. And then I also put the list position in, even though I didn't have much variation in there, because most of them were the party list leaders, but it's also a significant predictor. Okay. And then another thing I did a predicted probability of just a linear function of seeing if the overall gender equality in the society, because here we see that it's not a significant predictor really. But in a linear function, you see visually what's the interaction between gender and the overall gender equality in the society. And actually, we see here that the more gender equal the society is, it's bad for male candidates in order to receiving coverage, and that's positive for female. I couldn't put the 95% confidence intervals on it, so because that's the reason that it doesn't become significant really. This, but I mean, I also have a very small sample, and I think this visualizes actually that there is an impact from the overall gender equality too. And just in summary, okay. But this is actually I already talked about. So, thank you.